There's not even like a projector. I'll just leave divots in the wall. All right, good morning and welcome to the Four Lakes Church of Christ. We'll go ahead and get started with our second lesson of our Bible class this week. We're going to hit a little bit of Bethany from last week that we didn't finish up, and then go on to Okay, I will call out the verses then. We are going to be. Well, we'll cover it when we get there. Technically, we're going to the third part of that one, so Baxter didn't get it wrong. We're going to be in Luke 24 verses 50 through 53 to get started this morning, and then we'll move on to Bethlehem after we finish out Bethany, and we'll see if I can kind of catch up. But anyway, let me see if I. Okay, cool. There's the map. We'll just stay there. And I guess I must have complained to Baxter too much last week about not having a laser pointer, because now I have two ways to point. I have a laser pointer, and apparently he found me this at Swap, which I think I'm much more interested in using, where I'll walk over and just do that. But I don't know if it's as satisfying when you don't have the like projector hang down thing, where I feel bad about just smacking the wall. Like I'll probably leave something in it or whatever. So we'll see, for my 1 minute use of the map, which thing I decide to use. But hopefully that's a little bit helpful. But if you all have other thoughts on other things that would be helpful up there, just let me know. But like I mentioned, we're going to pick back up with we were talking about down in Bethany last week. We talked about Mary and Martha and the resurrection of Lazarus, and we read the verses for kind of the ascension of Jesus. We're not going to spend a ton of time on that this week, but if you want to be turning over with me to um, Luke chapter 24, verses 50 through 53, we're going to read those together again and talk about a few points there, and then we'll move on to the lesson for today. So Luke chapter 24, verses 50 through 53. And he led them out as far as Bethany, and he lifted up his hands and blessed them. While he was blessing them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. And they, after worshiping him, returned to Jerusalem with great joy and were continually in the temple praising God. And so we see here, after first of all, there was some prophecy that was fulfilled. So it is written, we see before that the Christ would suffer and rise from the dead on the third day. And people would witness all the great things that he did kind of in the subsequent verses that we didn't read. But some of the things that I wanted to mention, that we see Jesus do here, he leads them out as far as Bethany. So we've got him going, from Jerusalem down to Bethany for this that we talked about last week. Roughly, I think we mentioned it was roughly a 2-mile journey. And then it's interesting in verse 50, like he doesn't, he's taught them a lot. He's taught his disciples a lot the whole time he's been with them. But in this kind of like last send off here that we see here in Luke 24, the people that are witnessing this, he doesn't give them, even more instruction. He doesn't say, okay, I want to tell you these last couple things, before I ascend here. He lifts up his hands and he blesses them. And I think that this is something that like we can definitely take away from Jesus as our example. It's not wrong to give instruction, and we see other authors throughout the New Testament do that. Like a lot of times, like when we've studied Paul's letters or different things, like he will give a lot of admonishment or encouragement or correction and different things. But it's also important here that like Jesus blesses them, and then kind of leaves them in verse 51. While he's blessing them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. So it's just reminding us that like Jesus is so focused on like taking care of us, blessing us, giving us grace, things like that, versus just focused on like telling us, oh, you're wrong in these areas and you need to correct these things. And then we see the response that his disciples and the people that have been following him feel here in verse 52. It says they worshiped him, returned to Jerusalem with great joy. And so why do you think that they felt joy here instead of sadness with him leaving? We've seen other areas, even with Jesus himself, where like the apostles or different people were like sad or didn't, necessarily understand what was going on. Why do you think there was joy here? Yeah.
Well, he's given them the promise that he was going before them and to prepare a place for them. So he said, if I leave you, I'm going to prepare a place for you. So they had hope in that.
Right. I think you hit it really well, that like they have this hope. I think people are finally starting to understand the entirety of the plan. It took even the people who were the closest to him in life a long time to understand that, he's not coming back to set up an earthly kingdom. He's not going to be like David, or he's not going to be like some of the other people from the Old Testament when, there was a stronger kingdom or different thing like that. He's not an earthly king, right? Like, and this kind of, I feel like just almost not seals the deal because it's not the end of all of it, but like it shows them like, there's a grander plan, and I think they start to put that together and they have that hope for the grander plan. And I think that can apply to us today as well, right? Like if we kind of focus on the small bits and pieces that we want in our lives or even in our Christian walk, instead of understanding the grand scheme of things and what we're trying to aim for in heaven, being able to be with Jesus for eternity, and we miss the big picture, then we also might not feel the joy that they felt when, Jesus was leaving them here. But if we understand, the entirety of God's plan for us, then we hopefully will be joyful, as we understand more of what he wants from us and understand more of his word. And we see in verse 53 that they are continually in the temple praising God. And I think that also, um, is important for us to remember today too, right? It's one thing that they see this amazing event happen and are energized and excited by it. I think that can happen to us a lot today, right? Like, I think back to it when I was baptized or different events that we might see other people do, or like we have really good gospel meeting or any number of things that can really energize us as Christians. And that's good. It's not a bad thing to be energized and relight the fire within you every so often, but we have to figure out ways to like keep that going throughout our lives, even when times are tough, even when things maybe feel less exciting or we're less on fire. We see here that they continued in the temple praising God. And we have to continue to do that, right? Like I could imagine what they've experienced, or as we talk through some of Jesus's other miracles that people have seen, it would be really easy to follow him for the weeks after that, right? But like as that energy dies down and maybe he moves on to another city that you're not in or whatever, keeping that energy up and that focus on the Christian walk is important. And I think we can take that away as an example here as well. And ultimately, like all of the, we'll talk some about prophecies and as we talk about Bethlehem today too, but all of the prophecies that have been fulfilled by Jesus living on the earth and dying in the way he did, and all the things that kind of go together. And what I was referring to is, the plan that God put in place. Like this still isn't the end of all that, right? Like it's a lot of the prophecy has been fulfilled and different things have happened, and Jesus has made the sacrifice that he needed to make. But there's still work to be done of spreading this news throughout the world, of spreading this good news, spreading the gospel, and we still have that responsibility today, right? Like just because Jesus isn't here walking amongst us like he was in the New Testament, we still have the responsibility to share that gospel, that good news, the ability for us as well as others to be saved with those around us. So I think those are some important points, at least that came to my mind as I was studying through this. Any other thoughts before we jump on to talk about Bethlehem? Yeah.
So it's almost reminding them that Jesus is always with you.
Yeah.
You may not know it or see him or understand, but he's always with you. So I would think that would be also a comfort, and that's why they would rejoice as well.
Yeah, it can. Hopefully, it's more of a comfort than like a scary thing. But I think like sobering from both of those perspectives, we can take comfort. And I think like that to me, you can get into like the difference between Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit, which we won't delve into that. But like I guess in my head, I always think of Jesus as not that he didn't correct people, but as more of that like comforting, like he went through what we've gone through. He understands, and like us just knowing that he cares about us can provide that comfort. So I think that's a really good point. Any other thoughts before we move on? All right. If not, we are going to jump to what I will attempt to cover today, which is Bethlehem. So, like I mentioned, in case you weren't here last week, what we were doing is we are going through some of the events of the life of Jesus, and instead of what we might typically study through as far as like chronological order or on, specific focuses, the way the class is oriented this quarter is we're going based on what happened in specific cities. And as far as I can tell from the teacher's book, it was like rough alphabetical order, skip Jerusalem, and then cover Jerusalem in the last 5 classes because there's so much that goes on there. So, because I was a little confused as why we didn't start in Bethlehem, just from a, where he was born perspective and all of that, and where some of the early stuff happened. But I think that's kind of how it's structured. So we'll see as we get along into that. Some quick context as far as where we'll be this morning. If you want to be turning over to Luke chapter 2, we'll start in the first verse there. Once we get to reading the scripture there, Luke chapter 2, verse 1, we'll be going through 1 through 20. But I think it's helpful, like we did last week, to kind of look at where Bethlehem is located. I was struggling to find it for a second. My brain shut off. Okay, so we got Bethlehem down here. So we see that it is, you know, located in kind of the region that we've been talking about so far. We were kind of centering around Jerusalem, and that Bethany was about 2 miles. From what I could tell, if you want to do the walking journey I mentioned last week, you got to go a little bit farther this week. From what I could tell, it was about 5 to 6 miles to south of Jerusalem to get to Bethlehem. And I think that's important for us to remember as we kind of think through this of like the, traveling that, Jesus and his family would have had to do as we study more of these cities, as we think of like Nazareth, where they were from, to Bethlehem. It's a lot longer journey. So I think those are important for us to keep in mind. Some of the other quick things that I saw mentioned about the city of Bethlehem, some points to point out is like, wasn't a super huge city. It's not like Jerusalem. I mean, there were a decent number of people there, but it wasn't that it was politically significant or anything like that. As far as that goes, it was close to power at this time, but not powerful. We do see Bethlehem talked about in the Old Testament, though. Bethlehem means house of bread. Could be looked at as a foreshadowing as Jesus being the bread of life. It's also, Ruth and Boaz lived in Bethlehem, city of David. 1 Samuel 16:1 says, "And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil, and go. I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons." So we know that Jesse was David's father. And so, we can see that reference there as well, that, ties. We have a lot of things of David pointing forward to Jesus as far as the lineage goes and different things like that. Jesus is even called the son of David later on. And so that has some, importance and bearing on something that we can keep in mind as we study through Bethlehem this morning. And then Micah chapter 5, verse 2 says, "But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting." So we know that, as I referred to earlier, like as a part of God's plan, like Bethlehem was where Jesus was going to be born. Even though his family's from Nazareth, and we'll talk about some reasons likely that was the case. But I think, with a lot of these things, there is some kind of behind the scenes things now that we have the whole Bible that we can kind of try to piece together as far as why certain things happened in certain cities. So I think that's some of the brief history of Bethlehem. Anything that I missed that comes to mind for people? Yeah.
Prophecy in the Book of Mormon, I think it was Alma 7 verse 10, that said that Jesus or the Savior would be born in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a difference between, there's an inaccuracy there.
Yeah.
And I think that's an easy one to keep in mind, because I think a lot of these people that come to our door would admit that yes, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but their book says he would be born in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So it's something to point out.
And I think that's a good reminder, because we haven't spent a lot of time talking about prophecy yet, but like part of the way we can verify the authenticity of the Bible is by being able to look back at the historical prophecies and seeing that they are all accurate and match up with what we see in Jesus' life. So probably won't have time to call out every one of them, but I'm going to try to call out some of the prophecy that we see as we go through the class this quarter. And I think that, other than the hope that it provided to the people that understood the Old Testament and looked to who Jesus was, I think it can also be useful for us to understand what those prophecies were and what they mean, because it helps. It's one of the ways that we can authenticate, like Baxter was saying, the authenticity of the Bible versus other religious texts. Any other thoughts on Bethlehem? Yeah.
The distance there, when I was looking around here, I don't think there's anybody in here that came less than 5 miles to get to this building this morning. So the distance was just kind of amazing.
Yeah.
5 miles, I'm going, oh, that's not even half as far as.
Right. Like, it, yeah.
And so a city the size of Madison would cover a big chunk on that map.
Right. Yeah. Like if we maybe I don't know. I'll see if I could do some superimposing or whatever. I struggle to even like get a good image. So we'll see. But I think that would be a useful frame of reference because I also off the top of my head don't know the width and height of Madison and what you consider Madison versus Fitchburg and all that. But that's a good point. And like just how much like cars have changed things too as far as like distances and I guess like convenience of us being able to get places and even like roads, right? Like as far as like when they're walking between Nazareth and Bethlehem or whatever, like I don't know off the top of my head what the road situation was and how good of paths they had, if they were I'll have to look into if we know more about if they were able to make mostly a straight line or if they had to zig and zag and stuff like that. But I think that's something that is interesting for us to remember, like I guess the conveniences we have versus the distances that they had to go, and like they were a lot closer on a map. But also, if they forgot something, it was a much bigger deal for them to go back and get something, or they might not have had the conveniences to pick up things that they needed and things like that. So a lot of times it was a very intentional decision for them to, walk to another city. Or as we'll talk about later, go from Nazareth to Bethlehem and that kind of stuff. So interesting thing to keep in mind too. Any other thoughts before we look at Luke? All right. If not, let's pick up together in Luke chapter 2. We'll start with verses 1 through 5. Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. Now, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. That was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all the people were on their way to register for the census, each to his own city. Now Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was betrothed to him and was pregnant. Okay, so we have here in these first couple of verses our, understanding of why, things transpired the way that they did. Jesus being born in Bethlehem. We see that, Caesar calls for the census to be taken. So what's the point of a census? Why do we do those today? Or why would have they done those in the past? Okay, that's probably the big reason is like we want to know how many people we have so we can make sure we're taking in all the taxes and getting all the money we're supposed to. So, it's kind of they want to count the people and where they live and different things like that. I'm glad that I don't have to like travel back to Kentucky to be counted for the census. And I'm sure, there's a lot of people who've moved around different places that we don't have to go back to like where we were from to, you know, be counted in our census because that would, even though like we mentioned, we have cars and planes and different ways to get around, that would probably be pretty annoying to have to go back there. But I'm sure their record keeping was not digital back then. Well, I'm confident of that, but it was probably a lot harder to keep track of people's movings arounds and comings and goings. I mean, we have enough trouble between states when we move states of does this state have, a registry of like, I remember I was trying to go on a work trip like 2 years ago and like verifying my vaccine since it's all healthcare stuff was so hard to do between the two states, and different things like that. So I am sure that was even harder to do back then, because of the limitations and the different record keeping that they needed to do. So we see that Joseph goes from the city of Nazareth to Bethlehem in order to register along with Mary, who was betrothed to him and was pregnant. Another thing that I wanted to mention as we look through here, we already kind of mentioned how like Joseph's lineage ties Jesus to David, Bethlehem, some of that stuff. But I also wanted to mention like we still have the interesting scenario like Joseph understands why Mary is pregnant, right? But like they are going to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and maybe they won't. I don't know if they're traveling with other people or whatever, but they like Mary's pregnant, and they're gonna have to deal with the fact, or like they may have people asking, like, "Oh, you're just betrothed, you're not married," as we see here. So they've also got kind of that to deal with as they walk along here. So that was just interesting to keep in mind. But I think that that's kind of the journey that they take here in the first 5 verses. And we see them go along that way, and that's why they end up in Bethlehem. Any thoughts there before we keep reading? All right, if not, we're going to keep going. Verses 6 through 20, we'll finish out this passage. Luke chapter 2, verses 6 through 20. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. In the same region, there were some shepherds staying out in the fields and keeping watch over their flock at night. And an angel of the Lord suddenly stood near them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terribly frightened. And so the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy, which will be for all the people. For today in the city of David there has been born for you a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." And suddenly there appeared with the angel a multitude of the heavenly army of angels, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace amongst people with whom he is pleased." When the angels had departed from them into heaven, the shepherds began saying to one another, "Let's go straight to Bethlehem then, and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has made known to us." And they came in a hurry, and found their way to Mary and Joseph, and the baby as he lay in the manger. When they had seen him, they made known the statement which had been told them about this child. And all who heard it were amazed about the things which were told them by the shepherds. But Mary treasured all these things, pondering them in her heart. And the shepherds went back, glorifying and praising God for all that they had heard and seen, just as had been told them. All right, so we kind of read back through the birth of Jesus. And so, I didn't even mention this when we were talking about how it would have been a little inconvenient to have to travel down for the census. But also, if you're this pregnant, I'm imagining that adds some extra layers of inconvenience to need to walk. I didn't actually look up the distance, but we can at least say if Jerusalem to Bethlehem is 5 or 6 miles, Nazareth to Bethlehem looks like it's at least 5 or 6 times that distance. So we've got like a decent walk going on here that's not going to be probably just a 1-day type deal, right? Like we would hop in the car and be able to cover that probably under an hour. But they this was quite the journey for them, so it was seems an inconvenient time to need to do this. But we know, as we were talking about as we ended the last class, like this is part of God's plan, and this all needed to happen to fulfill prophecy and all of the things that had been prophesied before. So we see that Jesus is, Mary gives birth, and then she wrapped him in cloths and then put him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. So I think most of us are kind of familiar with that part of the story, as far as like, Jesus being born in Bethlehem and being put in a manger because there was no room in the inn. Why might that be significant, though, along with some of the other things we've talked about with Jesus's life so far, versus like him being born in another way, or maybe in a more traditional setting? Yeah.
Well, it goes to, he had a very humble birth and upbringing and all of that. So you're coming as the king who's born in a stable. You're coming as the son of God who grows up in a small backwater town.
Right.
That's pretty anonymous until he decides to not be anonymous anymore.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's all part of who he is, who he came to be, and all that. So
yeah, because I alluded.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I alluded to how at the end of our study of Bethany, like that, and we kind of talked about in comments how he was like more relatable and like could be our comfort and different things like that. And it would be very difficult if, you know, he had been born and he would like come out in this kingly way, whatever that would have been at the time, of like all this prosperity or different things, and like triumphantly announce the birth of Jesus and everyone looked to that. It would have been a very different way that everything would have played out, and it wouldn't have been part of the plan. So,
You know, it's parallel to the city of David. So, and he's from the line of David. So David was born somewhere in that area around Bethlehem. David's children were all born, the later ones. You know, their births and upbringing were very different. But David came from Bethlehem, from a, you know, kind of a modest family, etc. So
yeah,
some parallel there.
Right, and I think that's a good point, and like takeaway for us is that a lot of the times either, you know, through God's direct plan of Jesus coming and being the sacrifice for us, that was done in, you know, through humility and things like that. But a lot of the times the people who God picks to do things it's not like, oh, they need to be from this royal lineage and like things like that. There were some specific laws in the Old Testament about like the tribe of Levi and who could do the priestly things, but still a lot of the people that we see, you know, driving forward Christianity and in the New Testament are not coming from like necessarily prominent places, right? And so I think we can take comfort and encouragement ourselves in that like just because we're not, you know, of a special lineage, and like part of the reason that some of that was destroyed, you know, as far as being able to even prove your lineage, was because that didn't matter as much anymore. You know, it doesn't matter to us today. We all have access to Jesus. We all have access to God in the same way. And so we study his word and we pray, and we can feel that closeness with him. And so that's, you know, something that's super important and valuable to us today. Any other thoughts on the birth there? Yeah.
Right now, I don't know that this is true.
Okay.
It's just something that made me think. So I had read that the manger, at that time, the manger was made of stone with a little trough in it. And they put the newborn, blemish-free newborn lambs in there to protect them from being hurt, damaged, whatever, trampled on from the other sheep, whatever. But then, you know, they were talking about that, you know, the manger that they referred to that Jesus was placed in was like that.
Yeah.
So he was no sin, no blemish. He was the perfect sacrifice. And I just thought that was kind of interesting. That was really true.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is interesting to think about like the lamb being led to slaughter and the different comparisons that we, you know, see between, you know, the ultimate perfect sacrifice that Jesus was and the sacrifices from before, in kind of ways that we can understand. So I think that's an interesting point. Okay, and then as we go through kind of past that, we see, you know, the shepherds. They were in the same region, staying in the fields, keeping watch over the flock. And, you know, the angels announce this good news to them. You know, we see kind of things that we've talked about in previous classes where when people, you know, see angels, like in verse 9, the glory of the Lord shone around them and they were terribly frightened. That is a pretty typical response to seeing angels, or, you know, even, like we mentioned, like Jesus not even being recognized in some instances. Some either people are terribly frightened because there's so much glory going on, or they don't recognize who they are because that's the chosen mechanism for like, you know, them to come back. So here we see the angels coming and they're frightened, but they're told not to be afraid because there's good news and great joy. The Savior has been born. And so the angels kind of give them the description of what they need to be looking for that we just read about in the first couple of verses. You know, there's going to be a baby wrapped in clothes lying in a manger. And then there was a whole heavenly army of angels praising God and saying glory to God in the highest. And so if we can put ourselves in the shepherd's shoes or sandals or whatever they were wearing back then for a second, like we're, you know, they're just out tending their flock. Like, I don't know that any of them, or we have any indication that they're expecting this necessarily. But, you know, these angels show up, scare them to begin with, and then they're excited about the good news and, you know, rush to see, what's gone on with this birth. They say, let's go straight to Bethlehem and see that this thing has happened, which the Lord has made known to us. And so, again, something for us to take away, like, we've probably encountered this even in our own lives, either maybe personally when we learned about the gospel, or like maybe in other people that we've talked to. It's not always a guarantee that they are going to feel this level of joy, but I feel like a lot of times in those maybe rare instances when people truly do understand the gospel and when it like clicks in their head, they have a similar response where they want to hurry and they want to understand more, or they want to be baptized. And we see even different examples of that in the New Testament, but I'm sure we can all think of examples maybe in our own lives even where we've seen that, where somebody, it all clicks about how great this is and what it means for us, and that there's that level of energy. And I think the lesson for us too is like when they understand this, they don't sit around and say like, let's finish up what we were doing with the sheep, or let's do this or that. They're like, we understand that this is a big deal and we're going to go, we were just told by angels about this. Like we need to act on this information that we have now. So I think that's another takeaway for us is like, there are going to be opportunities that are presented to us or different things that come up in our lives where, we need to act because we've gotten, information. I mean, that can apply to anything, but especially in a spiritual sense, right? Like where we have a responsibility as Christians that we need to go and take care of. And we see a great example here from the shepherds. And then, we see in the later verses, they came in a hurry, they saw Jesus, and, they, based on what the angels had said and what they were seeing, could put two and two together, and they knew that this was the child that had been talked about. And so then anyone around there were amazed by the things that they heard from the shepherds. And like, I think some of the, like you have this, like, we talked about the humility of the birth of Jesus, right? But then also the grandeur of like angels coming to the shepherds and telling them about this and them rushing off. Like you can kind of see both sides of this. But I think one of the big reasons that like things happen the way they do, especially like at the time that these things were taking place in history, is because the way that people were going to learn about Jesus and understand who he was pretty much word of mouth, right? And so if Jesus had just been born and there was no level of verification of this at all, certain people might have missed out about hearing about this, right? Like this is very early on in like the plan that we talked about, but there's importance to the verification that happens from the shepherds hearing this from an angel, or the angels that talk to them going and verifying it for themselves, and then being able to tell other people and share that excitement. And I think that is, like I've already mentioned, a duty that we have today as well, like through the verification and authenticity that we have seen in the Bible, sharing that good news with others. And Mary treasured all these things, and then the shepherds went back glorifying and praising God for all that they had seen and heard, just as had been told them. And again, we see another example of when you've seen this great thing, or you kind of understand at least part of the plan for them at this point, the level of excitement and how that caused them to have, the behavior that they did. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind too. And the last thing I'll mention, when we already kind of hit this point around humility too, is it wasn't like the angels came to somebody that was like, I am the town orator, or I am a person who you would expect to make these announcements, right? It is shepherds who are in a field who were not even necessarily expecting this, that are, I guess I would consider more common, that can go and share it with other people. And so we don't have to expect that, this good news is going to be coming from, people in a high position or whatever might be the case. So any thoughts there before we jump on to Matthew? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think that's, something that's important for us to just keep in our minds, because I think it can often be very easy with whatever task comes up against us, whatever responsibilities that we might see, to help someone in our neighborhood, or like thinking something's an insurmountable task as, a Christian that we should be doing. Like the people that were picked all throughout the Old and the New Testament were not, grandiose. And I think that that's something, at least I find myself needing to remind myself often, is like it was just regular people who did the things that they were commanded to do. They didn't even do them perfectly all the time, but like that's what we're supposed to do today as well. Any other thoughts before we head to Matthew? Yeah.
Great company from heaven. I mean, it was a big deal here because in the beginning, but just having that presence, where it was in Major, Barnabas, just to come and witness what God is about to begin. I mean, it was huge. And then they went back, and just to witness that, the statement was how big this is going to be. It's a savior of the world.
Right.
I think it had to happen that way.
Yeah.
Just to give that extra oomph,
Right.
so to speak.
Yeah, it's that still just like gets to, like of the both sides of the humility, but also the like how humble of a birth it was, but like needing, it to be this special as well. Yeah, it's such a big deal, and like what it means for us, what it meant for them back then, and everything, it's just amazing. Yeah, Pat.
It's a big deal. A big deal for us to see like the Northern Lights, and and they always tell you on the news it's going to be tonight, and everything. So they were just doing their thing, and the angel came to them. I mean, that must have been really spectacular.
Yeah.
In the dark night, and the angel, and then all of a sudden a multitude of angels.
Right. That's not something they're going to forget,
I
and they're going to
know.
like share. You're going to be
Let's go-
talking about that for
Let's
years
go
and years.
check this out.
Yeah. 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 All right, let's jump over to Matthew chapter 2. I think I'm just gonna, you all know this, I'm gonna be persistently behind for the entire quarter, but we'll read this together and try to draw some quick application from it. Matthew chapter 2, I'm gonna read verses 1 through 12. Matthew 2, 1 through 12. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him, and gathered together all the chief priests and scribes of the people. He inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judah, for this is what has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for from you will come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared, and he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him." After hearing the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star, which had been seen in the east, went on ahead of them until it came to a stop over the place where the child was to be found. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And after they came into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And after being warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. And so here we kind of see not a complete contrast, but like even as Baxter just mentioned, like Herod didn't get a birth announcement, right? Like, but we know why he might be concerned about Jesus coming, right? Because Jesus coming, at least from their worldly understanding, might mess with his power and the control that he has, right? So he wants to be well aware of this situation. And so we have these Magi from the east that arrived in Jerusalem. asking for, where is Jesus? This child that's born, the King of the Jews, I guess is how they referred to him. And Herod gets wind of this because they're asking around, which is also interesting that they, you know, it wasn't like the shepherds, right? Like they weren't given, here's where you need to go and here's what you need to do. They were asking around about where they needed to go. And that's how like Herod kind of got wind of the plan that was going on and asked him to kind of like spy out. And he sounded like he was, altruistic in the sense like, I want to go and I want to worship him. But I think we know from what we know about Herod that was not necessarily true in what we see later on in this passage. So then we see, the prophecy, one of the prophecies that's fulfilled here as we go down through, and we see Herod trying to get more information from the Magi, and he gives them the directive of go and search for this child, report to me so I can come and worship him. But like I already mentioned, it's very likely that instead Herod was more focused on, how maybe he wasn't going to eliminate Jesus. We don't know for sure, but like he wanted to be in control of the situation nonetheless. I think we can be pretty confident of that fact. And so they went on their way. They saw the star, followed it to the place where they found Jesus, the child that had been born. And they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And so I think we see another group of people who are, very excited about this. They know what this means. It was a different way than what happened for the shepherds, but they were still, very excited about this because they understand what it means to them. And so they see Jesus with his mother Mary, they fall down and they worship. And, like we know from other things that go on throughout the New Testament of people accusing Jesus later on when he's older of like, why are you accepting worship? Why are you doing these things? Like that there were definitely people like they were not supposed to worship anyone but God, right? And so like that these magi and, we see the reaction of the shepherds too, they understand the situation and then they know they can worship this child because of who Jesus is. I think that is, important for us to, keep in mind that they had this level of understanding. They presented presented their treasures and their gifts that we see here. And then they're warned in a dream, not to go back to Herod and tell him what's going on, where the child is, right? Because we know Herod's going to do things that are potentially dangerous to Jesus. So, they've been warned and they leave for their own country. And I think like a couple quick points there. We see different responses between people, right? I already mentioned Herod has this fear. He's like, what's going to happen to my power? We see these wise men who are like seeking out Jesus, right? They weren't given the exact location immediately, but they seek out, they ask questions, they worship, they make sacrifices, like, which is the attitude that we're more supposed to have today. We are supposed to be seeking out Jesus. We are supposed to understand who he is, worship him because of that, understand the sacrifice, make sacrifices in our own lives. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind. And then ultimately the Magi understood after this dream, that God gave to them that they weren't supposed to return to Herod. They know that there could be potential repercussions for that, right? Like it's not like Herod's going to be like, oh yeah, I told these guys to do this thing. I'm in a position of power and they didn't listen to me. That's fine, right? Like, so they also have that level of worry, that they have to have in their minds, but they know that that's the right sacrifice to make in this moment because, they understand at least this part of the plan. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind too. So I flew through that. Any thoughts about what we just read before we close out this morning? All right. If not, then I think next week is Bethsaida. I will be out of town, and I think I know who's backing me up, but I won't say it yet until they have formally agreed. But all right, we will pick up with Bethsaida next week, and I will make sure Baxter has all the verses and stuff. I guess I can turn over there and call those out in case anybody wants to read ahead. Actually, there's a lot of different ones. I may just have you email out the verses for people to read ahead of time because I think there's 4 different passages. So, all right. Thanks, everybody.